Our guest tonight is Dr. Ned Dobos, who is Senior Lecturer in International and Political Studies at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. His subject is Iraq, Afghanistan, and the overuse of military force. Dr. Dobos approaches this matter as an ethicist. He holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Melbourne, and he's not going to be discussing tonight the particulars of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or speculating about the future or the strategic implications, but to focus on the ethical challenge posed by this situation. Basically, his question is, should we ever have initiated these wars? What are the features of human psychology that explain why states are prone to overuse or misuse military force? And are we condemned to continue to wage such wars? Dr. Dobos will speak for around half an hour. After that time, we'll have half an hour or so for questions. We ask you to lodge your questions using the Q&A Zoom function, and our question coordinator will then pass those questions to Dr. Dobos. So it's over to you, Dr. Dobos.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I'm going to start with some admittedly very cursory remarks about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, because they're in the past and I want to focus on primarily on the future. Let me start by being explicit about the ethical framework that I'm subscribing to here. Surprise, it's the just war tradition. I'm sure many of you listening are familiar with it, but in case you're not, just war theory essentially says that insofar as resorting to war invariably involves killing and maiming lots of people, there's a very powerful moral presumption against it. It's not an ethically innocuous decision. The default is that you shouldn't do it unless some very stringent conditions are satisfied. So what are those conditions? Well, I can list them. You need to have a just cause, which is limited to self-defense against actually occurring or imminent attack. The war also needs to be a last resort, taken after the peaceful alternatives have been exhausted. You need to stand a reasonable chance of success. Otherwise, all of the killing and maiming is for nothing. There's no benefit that compensates it. And the expected costs of war must be proportional to the anticipated benefits. So the war needs to pass this kind of moralized cost-benefit analysis. This is the principle of proportionality. Okay, so these conditions are treated as being individually necessary and jointly sufficient. But by that I mean, if all of the conditions are met, then it's permissible to go to war. If any one of them is not met, then recourse to war is ethically unjustified. So each of them is necessary and all of them together are sufficient for a quote unquote just war. Now, my view is that both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq failed to meet one or more of these conditions. In relation to Iraq, most people seem to think that, at least most people I've encountered and discussed this with, seem to be of the view that the war was unjust because Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But actually, even if he did have them or was attempting to acquire them, the war still wouldn't have been just. If my neighbor comes to my door threatening my life with an illegal handgun, say, well, then I can permissibly use violence in self-defense. But on the other hand, if my neighbor just happens to illegally own a gun, I can't go over there and kill him right now in anticipation of what he might decide to do with that gun at some point in the future. There may be all sorts of other things that I would be justified in doing, but going over there and killing people preemptively to neutralize this incipient threat that I perceive is just not one of them. Anticipatory or preventive uses of military force are not justified, just like anticipatory or preventive uses of violence are not justified in domestic society. So therefore, even if Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, in my view, disarming him would not have been a just cause for war against Iraq. So the argument which says the war in Iraq was unjust because Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction, to me, that's entirely wrong-headed. It concedes too much insofar as it implies that the war would have been justified if Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction. Not the case. As for the war in Afghanistan, I think that too was unjust, but for different reasons. For one thing, I'm not convinced that it was a last resort apart from anything else. The Bush administration at the time showed no patience for considering and exhausting the peaceful alternatives to war. And I suspect that that was at least partly because the war was less defensive and more punitive. It wasn't so much about preventing future attacks as it was about getting back at the perpetrators of the previous attacks and those who harbored them. So whatever peaceful alternatives you'd like to imagine, they may have been just as effective in protecting America against future attack, maybe even more effective, but those alternatives would not have satisfied the desire for revenge. And that, I think, goes a long way towards explaining why there was no real appetite for exhausting the peaceful alternatives on that occasion. All right, so for these reasons and others, I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq should never have happened. They were terrible mistakes. They were unjust wars. I've been thinking for quite a long time about why it is that states wage these unjust wars. Why do states so often misuse the military assets at their disposal? If you look through history, and I'm no historian, but these unjust wars, they're not the exception, they're the rule. There have been thousands of inter-society wars in recorded history, and just war theorists agree amongst themselves on the justice of exactly one of them, namely World War II. Maybe there have been a few other just wars in the mix, but there have been a great many more unjust wars. States regularly use their armed forces in morally stupid and reprehensible ways. Happens all the time. So why? That's what I've been thinking about. Here's the obvious answer. The obvious answer is simply this. Governments just don't care about justice all that much. They have other concerns, which will tend to trump whatever moral reservations they may have. Political leaders are concerned about preserving alliances and access to resources and their own political ambitions and so on and so forth. So you might think statespersons, political decision makers, they're prone to use military force unethically because they're not ethically motivated enough. They don't care so much about what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust, what's fair and unfair. They care about economic aggrandizement or power or whatever. Now that might strike you as quite a cynical answer. And it is, but I think it's probably not quite cynical enough, because I think that even purely motivated and morally well-adjusted politicians who understand the concepts of just war theory and are genuinely committed to following its requirements, I think that even they can be expected to misuse the militaries at their disposal. So even politicians that are sincerely committed to not waging unjust wars, they're going to wage them sometimes. It's quite a depressing thought. So let me explain how I arrived at it and why I think this is the case. the abstract gives it away. Our heads, unfortunately, are full of unconscious biases that distort our perceptions of reality. By now, there's a long list of these biases that have been studied and documented by psychologists and behavioral economists primarily. For example, people have an unconscious bias towards overconfidence. Not all people, there are exceptions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, people with depression apparently do not tend to overestimate themselves, but people generally do. So I've got some data here to back this up. Right? 94% of university researchers believe that they do above average work. Only 2% of people believe that they are below average in leadership abilities. 25% of people place themselves in the top 1% in terms of their ability to get along with others, their affability. 98% of people place themselves in the top 50% in terms of intelligence. So something's obviously gone wrong here. These numbers don't add up. People tend to, most people have a greater appreciation of their abilities than what they actually have. All these people can't be right. In addition, we tend to underestimate the likelihood of bad things happening to us. Everything from car accidents to crime, to illnesses, earthquakes, depression, unwanted pregnancy. It won't happen to me mentality is pervasive. Okay, so we overestimate our abilities, therefore have overconfidence, and underestimate the likelihood of things not going to plan, if you like. Since people have this tendency towards overconfidence, it's hardly surprising that political decision makers pretty much always think that victory is certain when they wage war. With only a few exceptions, the wars of the century from 1815 to 1914 were undertaken with every side believing firmly that it would win. And that includes World War I. All parties to it were certain that success would come quickly and easily. And I'll quote historian Jeffrey Blaney here. He says, quote, "While German generals predicted that within 6 weeks of the outbreak of war, their vanguard would be near Paris, the French generals predicted that their soldiers would be at or across the Rhine by that same time." So everyone thinks they're going to win. Fast forward to more recent history, let's go back to Iraq. Again, we find these inflated assessments of the prospect of success. Most famous, Donald Rumsfeld's assistant, Ken Edelman, predicted that the war would be a quote unquote cakewalk for the US and its allies. And we saw how that turned out. Later, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, he admitted that the planning for Iraq was based on, his words, the most rosy predictions, including that the US would be welcomed by the Iraqi people, that any resistance would peter out quickly, and that former Iraqi soldiers would willingly provide security to the new regime. All right, so things didn't quite pan out that way. There are many possible explanations for these over-optimistic forecasts. It might be because of faulty intelligence. It might be trust in divine providence, maybe willful ignorance, mental disorder, whatever you like. But there's another plausible explanation, more charitable to the parties involved, which is that even decent, well-adjusted people tend to be more confident than is objectively justified. And that's what the research in psychology and behavioral economics shows. So what are the implications of that? Well, remember I said earlier, I set out these various conditions that need to be met in order for war to be justified. One of those conditions was you need to stand a reasonable chance of success. A predictably futile war is an unjust war because it inflicts all of this harm for no compensating benefit. Problem is, because of the bias towards overconfidence, war makers will tend to judge their own side to have a reasonable prospect of success, whether or not they actually do. So we've got a problem, right? Just war theory demands a reasonable prospect of success, but then you've got this cognitive bias which impairs people's ability to make a sound, impartial assessment of their likelihood of success. Now, I don't have time to get into it today, but I think the same goes for all of the other conditions of just war theory, which I listed earlier. For each of those conditions, I can identify at least one cognitive bias which interferes with people's ability to make an impartial, rational assessment as to whether the condition is met. So cognitive biases are bound to distort the various judgments that need to be made to determine whether recourse to war is ethically justified. And those biases will almost always result in a false positive. The war is just, we think the war is just when it isn't, rather than a false negative. We judge the war to be unjust when in fact it's just. All right, so if I'm right about all this, then even morally motivated decision makers that are well-versed in just war theory and committed sincerely to never waging unjust wars, they're going to wage unjust wars sometimes because their own cognitive biases will lead them to see their unjust wars as just. Right? All right, so looking to the future, the upshot is this. If we want to avoid more unjust wars, the next Afghanistan, the next Iraq, it won't do to simply elect ethical leaders and give them training in just war theory. I wish that was enough. It's not. Even if we do that, our future leaders are still going to be liable to overuse our military assets. So that's the problem. What's the solution? How can we prevent our military from being misused or overused? There's a whole suite of options here. Here's one quite radical one. You abolish the military, okay? Like Bernard Brodie once said, the best way to keep people out of trouble is to deny them the means of getting into it. Costa Rica disbanded its armed forces back in 1948, shut the whole thing down, turned the army barracks into a museum, wrote it into the constitution that the military as a permanent institution is henceforth proscribed, and to this day they celebrate their military abolition day on December 1st each year, public holiday. Now that's not the only solution to the unjust war problem that I've been talking about. It's kind of the nuclear option, if you like. But it's the one that I've been thinking about a little bit lately. So I'm just going to say a few words about this proposal to abolish the military as a permanent institution. See what you think. There's this unspoken assumption that having a military enhances our national security, and that the stronger our military is, the more secure we are. Or at the very least, the assumption is our security can only move in one direction as we increase our military capabilities, and that direction is up. We can only become more secure. And I want to put a bit of critical pressure on that reasoning by using a thought experiment. My background's in philosophy. We use a lot of these kind of hypothetical thought experiments just to get our intuitions pumping, if you like. So I'll share one with you tonight, so play along. So imagine you're about to enter a gathering where you know that there are several murderous bandits that will be present, people that are seriously nasty characters that are prepared to use violence to get their hands on your property. Unfortunately, there will be no security guards, no police there to defend you. But before you enter, you are offered a knife to carry for self-protection. All right, so if you have no other information to go on, it would seem prudent and rational to accept the weapon in this scenario. It will make you safer, right? You'll have some means of defending yourself. But now let me add some more details to this picture. Suppose that in addition to these murderous bandits that I've described, there will be two other kinds of undesirables in this gathering. There are going to be these highly paranoid schizophrenics that think that everybody else is out to stab them. And on top of that, there are also these tough guys eager to prove just how tough they are in a knife fight. Okay, so you got these three groups, and suppose that members of all three groups are armed, these three kinds of threats. So now let me put the question to you again. Is it still prudent for you to accept the weapon? Does it still enhance your security? And suddenly it's not so clear. Suddenly the answer seems to be, it depends. Because if you do openly carry the knife into the gathering, it will probably have some deterrent effect on the murderous bandits, since it makes an attempted robbery of you considerably riskier for them. They would be better off choosing a defenseless person, an easier target. At the same time, however, openly carrying the knife makes you a target for the highly paranoid types, because they're not interested in your property, but they are serious about neutralizing the threats that they perceive. And the knife in your hand puts you squarely in that category. As for the tough guys, they prove nothing to anyone by attacking defenseless children at the gathering. The status they seek can only be gained by challenging and vanquishing worthy adversaries. And again, your weapon makes you a candidate. Since you have a knife, you are more likely to be accosted by someone eager for a knife fight to prove their mettle. All right, so this obviously complicates your decision considerably. It might still enhance your security to accept the weapon, but it might not. It's going to depend on other variables now, such as the relative numbers of these different kinds of threats in the gathering. So the important insight is just that in scenarios like the one I've just described, we can't generalize that going in armed, that being armed is the rational thing to do. In some circumstances, being defenseless might increase your chances of survival, as paradoxical as that sounds. You could probably see where I'm going here. The international arena is just this gathering writ large. And I go back to Thomas Hobbes here. Recall, he says there are three causes of war. The first cause of war is competition. One state attacks another state to acquire its territory or resources. So in this case, the aggressor is the murderous bandit type. The second cause of war is diffidence. One state attacks another to neutralize a looming threat that the latter is thought to pose. In this case, the aggressor is the paranoid type. The third cause of war is glory. One state attacks another to gain esteem and recognition. And there's one particular researcher, Richard Ned Lebo, who says that most international aggression actually falls into this category. It's got nothing to do with resources. It's got nothing to do with security. It's just got to do with status seeking. So with respect to that third kind of aggression, the aggressors are these status seeking types looking for a fight to prove themselves. So Hobbes explains, I'll quote him, "The first cause maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation." Now, standing armies, permanent military establishments, insofar as they wield both offensive and defensive capabilities, they might deter the first kind of aggressor, the murderous bandit type aggressor, the competitive aggressor, but they are also liable to provoke the second kind of aggressor and to attract the third. Right? So this doesn't mean that it's always irrational or imprudent for a state to keep a military, but it opens up the possibility that it might be. Given that there are these different kinds of potential aggressors in the international system with distinct triggering conditions, a state's military establishment can be self-defeating in the sense of provoking more danger than it deters. So at first blush, the proposal to abolish the military may seem completely lunatic, but on closer inspection, maybe not. And there's a lot more to be said in this connection. I've said nothing about the fact that this is sometimes called the civil military problematique. States establish militaries to defend them against foreign threats. In order for the military to effectively defend the state against foreign threats, it must be powerful enough to overthrow the state itself. And sometimes it will. And so this gives you the risk of military coup. Since 1950, there have been about 232 military coups, and that's just counting the successful ones, not counting all of the unsuccessful ones, the most recent being the case in Myanmar. So by having a military, not only do you risk provoking paranoid aggressors, fearful aggressors, defensive aggression, as they sometimes call it, and these status-seeking aggressors, you also introduce the risk of coup into the environment. So in order to determine whether a military actually enhances national security, what we need to do is look at the respects in which militaries increase our security, but also look at the respects in which militaries decrease our security and see which is greater. But it's certainly not a no-brainer that a military must always and necessarily make our national security go up. That's a mistake. So look, that's the most radical proposal in terms of how to deal with this problem of our militaries being overused, to do away with them entirely. But like I say, there are many others. I'll leave it there. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. If you want more of my musings on unjust war and military abolitionism, sorry, I have to do it. Here's my latest book, Ethics, Security and the War Machine, available now from Oxford University Press. Happy to take questions.
Many thanks, Ned. So it's over to our question coordinator, Alex, with the first question.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ian. Before we begin, I just remind everyone that you can submit questions through the Q&A function, which you'll see on the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to get through all questions, but I can't guarantee that everyone will get a question depending on sort of how we're going with numbers and things. So the first question I want to put to you, Ned, is to what extent do Western-style democracies perpetuate unjust war, where the impetus is not justice, but political popularity?
Right. So I guess it depends on. So I'm sure many of the people that are in attendance here tonight have heard about or are familiar with the so-called democratic peace thesis. Democratic peace thesis being this idea that democracies are less inclined to wage war with one another, at least with one another, precisely because war tends to be unpopular amongst the masses. So if you've got an undemocratic and therefore unaccountable political leader, he or she, that person's much more likely to take recourse to war because they themselves are not going to bear the costs associated with the war. They spend other people's money, they put other people's lives on the line, and therefore are going to be more trigger happy, for want of a better term. Whereas when you've got a democratic society, where the government is accountable to the people, according to the democratic peace thesis, that should make war less likely, less attractive to the leadership. So according to that hypothesis, democracy is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. It's not, needless to say, it doesn't prevent states from waging unjust war entirely, obviously, but democratic forces, democratic pressures and institutions and norms, according to this thinking, make states less likely to wage unjust war than they would otherwise would be. That's all well and good in theory, but there's a guy in the United States, Cheney Ryan, who's written about something called the chicken hawk syndrome. And what he observes is that once upon a time, war amongst democratic populations, once upon a time, war tended to be quite unpopular because you had things like the national draft. And because of the national draft, even if you yourself were not drafted to go and fight the war, more often than not, you knew someone that did. And so it personally affected you in some way or another. So under that kind of arrangement, what Cheney Ryan calls nationalized war, where the costs of war are felt by the population and distributed more or less equitably through the population, in that kind of environment, war is going to be unpopular. And so democracy will put downward pressure on instances of war and the popularity of war. But what Ryan points out is that things have changed, and we've moved from nationalized war to what he calls post-nationalized war. And post-nationalized war is characterized by a small group of people fighting wars on behalf of the rest of us. And those wars, furthermore, being largely debt financed, so that we no longer experience the trade-off between guns and butter. We no longer have to make sacrifices for the sake of our country's wars. Okay, so because of this transition from nationalized to post-nationalized war, the average citizen no longer suffers the consequences of his country's decisions to wage war. The consequence of that is the chicken hawk syndrome. And a chicken hawk is essentially a person who's, in their ideology, a hawk. They're quite eager, or at least tolerant of their country's military adventures overseas. But they're a chicken in the sense that they don't themselves participate or bear any of the costs associated with it. So in this kind of environment, where you've got post-nationalized war preparation, the institutions and norms of democracy do not put as much downward pressure on a state's likelihood of taking recourse to war as the democratic peace thesis leads us to expect. So sorry, that's a very convoluted way of answering your question. I guess what I'm saying is, in theory, democracy should actually make states less likely to wage war, because the people don't want to bear the consequences of war. In theory, that's the way it's meant to work. But in practice, because we've moved to this post-nationalized arrangement for actually waging war, where the average Joe just doesn't suffer any of the consequences, my country could be fighting wars right now and it would make no difference to my life personally. That prevents these democratic institutions and norms from having the pacifying effect that they should.
Fantastic. The next question's a little bit shorter. it just goes, are there any recent examples of just wars?
It depends on who you ask. So there are not going to be any examples where all just war theorists will agree this war is just. I'm just trying to think if there's any recent war where there's some degree of consensus on the justice of the war. I guess the closest I can think of off the top of my head is the first Gulf War, the Gulf War to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. So in a lot of people's minds, that unequivocally satisfies the principle of just cause, because if anything constitutes a just cause for war, it is to counter military aggression. So we had an unequivocal just cause. It was, insofar as other things were tried and failed, it seemed to have been a last resort. The sticking point is whether the war was proportional, in the sense of were the costs excessive relative to the benefits. And there's also a fair bit of, one question we need to ask ourselves in relation to wars like this is whether I suggested that there's a consensus that national self-defense against aggression or the defense of others against invasion constitute a just cause for war. Even that is a little bit controversial, because in a lot of people's minds, it all depends on what the aggressor intends to do once they get there. So is the aggressor purely a political aggressor, meaning are they just there to conquer and rule and to extract resources? Or is the aggressor a genocidal aggressor, meaning they're there to kill and expel and enslave people? So depending on what kind of aggressor you're talking about, that's going to have some bearing on whether you think there was actually a just cause for war. But with respect to the Iraq war, most commentators in this, sorry, the first war against Iraq, the first Gulf War, most commentators in this space seem to think, well, at the very least, there was a just cause. It was a last resort. There was a reasonable prospect of success. Nobody thought that Iraq stood much of a chance. The sticking point is whether the war was proportional, whether it was worth the cost. And when we judge proportionality, it's not simply the costs for our own side, it's the aggregated human and material costs for all affected. So the question is, it was very costly for Iraq. A lot of Iraqi soldiers were killed. Was it really worth it for the sake of expelling Saddam's regime from Kuwait? Was it worth that amount of human life lost? That's the best. That's off the top of my head. That's the only recent war. I know it's a long time ago now, but that's the only war in living memory, if you like, where there's not much controversy about whether that war was just. Most just war theorists seem to be of the view that that's at least a candidate for a just war.
Great. Our next question is about the responsibility to protect. So it goes, is intervention justified where there's a risk of atrocious crimes being committed against the population? What are your thoughts on the responsibility to protect? For those that aren't familiar with the responsibility to protect, the concept holds that states have a responsibility to protect their populations from atrocities and that the global community should assist states to do so, and that if a state is sort of manifestly failing to do so, the international community must intervene. Intervention can include a range of options, including sanctions and diplomacy, but eventually involves military actions if necessary and approved by the United Nations Security Council. So, for example, would the international intervention be justified? Would it have been justified against the Islamic State unleashing a genocide against the Azeri population?
Okay, so this is another topic I've thought a fair bit about. One question is whether armed humanitarian intervention is permissible, whether it's justified, whether we have a right to do it under certain circumstances. And then the follow-up question is, if we have a right to do it under certain circumstances, do we perhaps have a duty to do it under those same circumstances? So that's the question of whether there's a responsibility to protect. My view on whether it's permissible to engage in armed humanitarian intervention where grave human rights violations are being perpetrated is and has always been something along the following lines. Suppose there's a government that's persecuting its own people, committing serious human rights violations against them. Presumably, we'd all agree that those people themselves have a right to defend themselves against those human rights violations. Now, it's a basic axiom of morality. If it's permissible for me to do something, then it's permissible for me to enlist the help of others to help me do that thing. So if these people are being persecuted by their government, being massacred, forcibly expelled, starved, whatever the case may be, it's permissible for them to defend themselves. Therefore, it's permissible for a foreign agent to come to their defense, to help them defend themselves, if you like. So in principle, yes, I think that armed humanitarian intervention in these sorts of cases is justified. In fact, I think that this is probably the most compelling just cause for war, where you've got genocide, massacre, ethnic cleansing, forcible starvation. I think if the use of military force is ever justified, it's then, in principle. The problem is, in practice, what often tends to happen, and it's for any number of reasons, the intervention is liable to not only fail, but not only fail to defend the population that are the intended beneficiaries of the intervention, but to actually make things worse for the intended beneficiaries. And there are all sorts of reasons why that might happen, and there are all sorts of examples of that happening. I'll give you an example just because it's fresh in my mind, because I was discussing it with some of the interns earlier. There was the humanitarian intervention in Kosovo, where the Serbs were ethnically cleansing the province's ethnic Albanian population from the region. NATO intervened to try and stop this from happening. The mode of intervention was largely high altitude bombing, no boots on the ground. What seems to have happened is NATO was dropping bombs on Kosovo. The Serbs on the ground got really aggravated by this and took their frustrations out on the Albanian population, so that before the bombing started, before the humanitarian intervention started, you had this many deaths and this many ethnic cleansings, this many people expelled. And then once the bombing started, once the intervention started, it just ramped up. So the humanitarian situation became considerably worse for the ethnic Albanians, at least in the short to medium term. So in principle, I think that The use of military force for humanitarian purposes can certainly be justified in principle. Trouble is when you look at real world examples and you notice that in those real world examples, it often happens that the intervention fails to make things better and sometimes makes things worse. Because of that, we've got to be wary of jumping from it's justified in principle to it's actually justified in the real world, all things considered. So that's the first part of my answer. It's justified in principle, often not in practice, because in practice, it often won't meet these conditions of just war. Proportionality, for instance, the benefits won't outweigh the costs. As for whether there's a responsibility to protect, so that's the much stronger claim that if there's ethnic cleansing or massacre happening in some foreign country and we're in a position to do something about it, we have an obligation to intervene to do something about it. It's a much stronger view. So it's not just that we have a right to do it, it would be wrong for us not to do it. That I'm not so sure about for the following reason. There are all sorts of ways. There's only a certain amount of money and energy that any country is going to invest in benefiting foreign nationals. Let's call it, aid and humanitarian assistance money and energy. It turns out that military humanitarian intervention just gets much less bang for your humanitarian buck than alternative kinds of foreign aid. So let's say Australia is going to engage in an armed humanitarian intervention to protect the victims of Islamic State. That was the example that was used. Sure, we could put those resources and devote those energies to protecting those people against those atrocities. Or we could take that same amount of money and that same amount of energy and direct it towards alleviating global poverty or malaria or something along these lines. And almost invariably, what you'll find is the non-military option achieves a better humanitarian result, is more effectively altruistic than the military option to prevent the atrocity. So because of that, unless we want to say that states have an obligation to be as altruistic as they possibly can, and to therefore go around doing, having an obligation to massively expand their aid budgets and engagement in humanitarian operations abroad, unless we want to say that, as long as we're acknowledging that states have finite resources that they're prepared to devote to doing good deeds in the world, I'm not sure that we should say they have an obligation to direct those scarce resources to the prevention of atrocities, responsibility to protect, when those same resources could do a lot more good when used in other ways. So I'm open to the idea that armed humanitarian intervention is justified, at least in principle, often not in practice, but at least in principle. Whether there's a duty or a responsibility to engage in armed humanitarian intervention in the face of atrocities, I think that's a much more complicated question. And my position as of right now is no, because you get more bang for your humanitarian buck by using that money in other ways.
Great. Our next question asks if you can comment about the role of American exceptionalism in the most recent wars that we've been talking about.
So certainly certainly played some role, but particularly with respect to the war in Iraq, because that was, at least on the main justification that was offered for it, which is Saddam's trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction, that was a preventive use of military force. So it's not that Saddam is attacking us, not even that he's planning on doing so, but it's that he might do so. And if he acquires these weapons, the consequences for us would be catastrophic, and we shouldn't have to wait. So this idea that the United States shouldn't have to wait, or it's intolerable for the United States to have to bear the risk that one of its enemies will acquire these weapons and then with those weapons unleash untold destruction on the American people. The idea that that's not acceptable, that America should have to tolerate that risk, that is an instance of American exceptionalism, because we do expect everyone else, every other country, to tolerate exactly that risk. When Bush was talking about the axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and then invaded Iraq, leading to reasonable suspicions that North Korea and Iran would be next. Nobody thought, well, given that the American administration is now threatening Iran and North Korea, they have reason to believe that they're next in line. Therefore, it's intolerable to expect them to sit around waiting for the risk to materialize. They would be justified in waging a preventive war against the United States. Nobody thought that. Nobody said that. Nobody thinks that any state has the prerogative to use military force preventively, simply to prevent other powers from becoming more powerful and potentially posing some threat in the future. The fact that we are willing to accept the proposition that perhaps the United States would be justified in doing that under certain circumstances, whether it's to prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring weapons of mass destruction and using them against the United States, or whether it's to prevent China from becoming the next hegemon in the region, that is American exceptionalism speaking. We don't think it's permissible, it's sort of beyond the pale, out of the question, that any other state would be permitted to use its military preventively in order to forestall certain possible future threats. We don't even consider that might be justified, but we do entertain the prospect as to whether or not the United States would be justified in doing it. And it's not just Americans that do this. I think a whole lot of us the world over buy into this kind of American exceptionalism. So to answer the question, yes, American exceptionalism did have something to do with the most recent wars, particularly the war in Iraq, I think. And the proof, well, one piece of evidence for this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The fact that people were saying things like the war in Iraq was unjust because Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction, suggesting that it would have been permissible if he did have weapons of mass destruction. That's essentially conceding that the United States has a prerogative to use military force preventively when nobody else does. So definitely there's an implied exceptionalism there.
I think this will be our final question for tonight. So the last question would be, do you think that the rise of private military corporations and the exponential privatization and outsourcing of war in general will fundamentally change our ability to prevent or hold to account the waging of unjust wars?
Will it prevent our ability to prevent will impede our ability to prevent the waging of unjust wars. Well, I mean, one way to think of it, the optimistic answer is no, because private military corporations are simply an instrument that the state deploys when in the prosecution of a war. So if the state and political decision makers decide that they're going to take recourse to war, they might deploy the national military, and if we deem that war was unjust, to the extent that we can, we hold our political decision makers responsible. If instead of deploying the national military, they increasingly rely on these private contractors, I don't see how that impedes the public's ability to hold the political decision makers to account for the decision to take recourse to war, because the only thing that's changed is the weapon that they've selected. Is it the national military or is it this privatized military? So that's the optimistic answer. We could still hold them responsible.
Why don't we end on a note of optimism, Ned? We're running up against our deadline. There are another dozen or so questions. We'll have to find some way of putting them to you as well.
Sure.
But many thanks to our questioners and to everyone who's participated tonight. We're currently conducting our online events in accordance with the COVID restrictions every second Tuesday. So on Tuesday, the 24th of this month, 24th of August, we'll be hearing from Ambassador Graham Fletcher, our ambassador to China. In the intervening week, we'll be continuing to issue our publication columns from Glover Cottages, in which counsellors and interns recommend books and articles and broadcasts and other material on international issues. But to round off tonight, I'd like to ask Luke Goldman, one of our new interns, to move a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Ian. On behalf of the Institute, I'd just like to thank Dr. Dobos for his address this evening. Ned has detailed the distinction between the moral acceptability of going to war and preparing for war, his account of the paradox of military sometimes provoking more danger than they deter. It's given us an intriguing insight that has often drifted from the forefront of debate surrounding conflicts in the Middle East. A number of great questions from our viewers were prompted by this address, and Ned has given some great answers, especially regarding the application of just war theory to the first Gulf War and humanitarian intervention. So thank you, Dr. Dobos, for your contribution to this debate and for your address tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening.